There's only a few names left, all of which won't change the landscape very much. We know the winners and losers, and at the top of the losers list is the Houston Rockets. They decided to give Dillon Brooks a 4-year, $80 million contract. Dillon Brooks, the guy that just shot 31% from the field and 23% from three in the playoffs. He was a pure offensive liability that was quite literally just being left open. A defensive possession win for the Lakers was a Dillon Brooks shot attempt. The more of those there were, the better the Lakers' odds were at winning. Then Fred VanVleet, a 3-year, $130 million deal, $210 million for the two. Fred VanVleet is going to be getting more millions per season than his field goal percentage last year. It's not just that. This contract is over $43 million a season. Fred VanVleet has never shot 43% for a season in his entire career. Both players didn't even shoot 40% from the field this past season. Now they bring more past their efficiency, but what they were going for, veterans, defense, underdogs, locker room impact, that could have been replicated at a fraction of the cost. Patrick Beverley and Bruce Brown, for example. Then they give Jock Landale a 4-year, $32 million deal. That one's actually a really good contract, as only 1 year is guaranteed. The other contracts are also not as bad as they first seemed. Fred VanVleet's 3rd year is a team option, so it's effectively a 2-year contract. Dillon Brooks' deal is descending, but not by a crazy margin. It's definitely not as bad as it looked when it was first reported, but that doesn't mean it isn't bad. They're one of the biggest losers we've seen in a minute. At the end of the day, they signed 2 players that are both net negative values the second pin hits paper. Then they go out and trade away a bunch of their young guys, including one of their first-round picks last season, Ty Washington, and KJ Martin, who had started over half the games this season. This was reportedly to clear up cap space for an agreed-upon contract with Brook Lopez, who decided to go back on that commitment. This just further emphasizes their placement as losers. I like them bringing in Jeff Green. I like their idea as a whole, but $220 million to bring in 2 extremely inefficient scorers to a team that had the 2nd worst efficiency in the league and the worst from behind the 3-point line is questionable. The goal is usually to bring in players that address your flaws, not double down on those flaws. The biggest winner is undoubtedly the Los Angeles Lakers. I didn't think there was a world where we would end up here. Even as the contracts were coming in, I couldn't imagine what would unfold. During the playoffs, they had this 8-man rotation of D'Angelo Russell, Austin Reeves, LeBron, Vanderbilt, AD, Schroeder, Rui, and Lonnie Walker. Some other players were in the mix, but that's who we saw night in and night out. This was a team that was formed months prior at the deadline and made it all the way to the Western Conference Finals. They lost Schroeder and Walker. That's it. They replaced Schroeder with a very comparable player, arguably better, the starting point guard of the Miami Heat, fresh off an NBA Finals appearance, Gabe Vincent. They extended D'Angelo Russell, overpaying him but only for 2 seasons. They re-signed Rui Hachimura to a fair 3-year, $51 million deal, and somehow re-signed Austin Reeves to a 4-year, $54 million contract. From day one, that is one of the best contracts in the league. They are clear as day winners. Then they took some shots on Jackson Hayes and Cam Reddish, guys that were top 10 picks 4 years ago. They bring in Taurean Prince, a veteran wing that's going to give them much more liability than they were getting from Troy Brown and Malik Beasley this season. This past 12 months has been a Rob Pelinka masterclass. Another obvious winner is the Mavericks. There was a real world where a year ago they lose Jalen Brunson, then trade Spencer Dinwiddie, Dorian Finney-Smith, and draft capital for Kyrie Irving at the deadline just to miss the playoffs and lose him 2 months later. They were also just 1 spot away from losing their first-round pick, but ended up using it to go down from 10 to 12 to get Derek Lively, someone they would have taken at 10. In the process, they picked up another late first, which became Olivier Prosper, and swapped out Davis Bertans for Richaun Holmes. It was a great draft. They were one of the biggest winners, but all of that wouldn't have mattered if they lose Kyrie. That didn't happen. They signed him on a 3-year, $126 million deal. They then signed Seth Curry on a steal of a contract who just a couple years ago was a pivotal part of them having the best offense in the league. At the end of the day, with Kyrie and Luka, they're going to be a great offensive team. That's further solidified by bringing in Seth Curry. The concerns were always defense. They addressed that as much as they could. Prosper, Lively, Holmes. It's not perfect, but they were just 1 spot away from losing their draft pick, and then they could have realistically seen Kyrie walk, leaving Luka stranded with Reggie Bullock, Maxi Kleber, and Jaden Hardy. Yeah, they're winners. Then there's the Pacers. This is what you do when you're a young team. Take notes, Houston. The Pacers are going to shock some people. They were already a much better team than most expected this past year. Halliburton broke out. They hit on their first rounder with Mathurin. Then they go out in the draft and land an incredible prospect, especially defensively in Jarris Walker. They add some shooting with Ben Shepherd at the end of the first. Hit free agency, give Halliburton the bag, a ton of money, but there was no other option there. Then they signed Bruce Brown to a 2-year deal worth around $40 million. That's a ton of money to give a guy that averaged just 12 points a game. But Bruce Brown is one of the most unique players in the entire league. That 12 points a game is extremely deceiving. This is someone that has played nearly every position on the court in his young career. This is on the back of his extremely versatile defense. On offense, he can play on and off the ball, fitting alongside a point guard like Halliburton. He brings this team someone that has experience being on the best team in the league, making a title run. Yeah, it's an overpay, but it's an overpay with zero risk whatsoever. Once signed, it has at least neutral value, probably positive value, as all these contenders that couldn't go after him in free agency due to salary cap constraints can now bring him in by matching his salary, a salary that has a super short time commitment, shorter than most realize. There's a team option on that second year. It's effectively a 1-year contract. They weren't going to bring in any of the big names. Go overpay the best role player for a season. They now have this young ascending group that feels like a group of vets. You've got to love what they're doing. Then they take a flyer on Obi Toppin, someone that was a top pick just a couple years ago. The fit was terrible in New York, but he showed some great flashes. Why not take the risk with some second rounders? Beautiful. Now, it wasn't a free agency move, but it coincided, so I'm throwing it in. A year ago at the deadline, the Pacers are Sabonis and Turner with their contracts quickly ticking. Now it's this young, promising, well-built group with an identity. Now, you don't have to bring in people to be a winner in free agency. Sometimes it just takes bringing everyone back, and that's exactly what the Bucks did. They were put in a weird spot with Chris Middleton. At 31 years old, he didn't look like the Middleton we've come to know this past season returning from injury. But the Bucks flat out just couldn't afford to let him leave, and if max money wasn't on the table, he was going to be going elsewhere. They bring him back on a 3-year, $102 million deal. Another big one was Brook Lopez, someone that's established himself as one of the best rim protectors in the entire league, something we rarely see at this stage of a career. At 34 years old, he was second in voting for Defensive Player of the Year. This was another tough spot though. He is old. They could not go overboard and luckily didn't. They're definitely paying him a lot, $24 million a season, but it's only a 2-year commitment. Then they bring back Jay Crowder. It wasn't a flashy offseason, but it was the one they needed to have. Their first round exit isn't a great sign, but we all know once this team gets and stays healthy, they are one of the top contenders. And Vegas also knows that. After all this free agency chaos, they sit with the 3rd best odds at the title. Then there's the Knicks. I'm not sure how or why Josh Hart only accepted his player option. I didn't see that coming. I thought he was headed to a massive payday. Then they go out and get Donte DiVincenzo on a 4-year, $50 million deal. It's crazy that Reeves only went for $4 million higher, but that's more a reflection of how good his contract is. This is a great deal and a great pickup. His skill set is one of the most sought after in the league today for contending teams. A two-way wing that can hit threes and is at least okay with the ball in his hands. The Knicks now have 3 guys that fit that mold, in Hart, Grimes, and DiVincenzo. From a roster construction standpoint, this team is constructed beautifully. The only problem they face at the present is their top-end talent. Julius Randle has fallen apart in the playoffs year in and year out. We keep waiting on this RJ Barrett jump that just doesn't come. He's shooting practically the same terrible efficiency he was as a rookie. Jalen Brunson was a home run for them a year ago, but they need more from these other max guys. Luckily, they might not need it from them specifically. New York is one of the better set up teams to make a big move this season. With young guys like Grimes and Quickly, a decent amount of first-round picks for next season alone, they can put together a pretty good deal without sacrificing too much of this rotation. I really love what they've done, and then come on. How cool is it that they're reuniting the 2016-2017 NCAA champion Villanova teams with Brunson, Hart, and DiVincenzo? Now all they need is to bring in Mikal Bridges. Now let's get into some of those losers. Anyone with half a brain cell knew it was the right time for the Blazers to look to the future and move on from the Lillard era. But over the last couple months, they held strong that they were committed to building a contender around him. They were expected to make a massive deal involving their 3rd overall pick in the draft. They didn't manage to get that done and walked away with an incredible prospect in Scoot Henderson. But even after that, their mentality didn't shift. They were still focused on the present. They showed that by kicking off free agency, re-signing Jeremy Grant on a 5-year, $160 million deal. Grant is a great player. You can maybe even rationalize the yearly price tag on a short-term commitment. But man, dedicating $160 million to a non-all-star approaching his 30th birthday, that's questionable. It was a decision clearly made in the effort to show Lillard they're focused on winning, but shortly after, Lillard would request a trade, leaving the Blazers holding this bag, a bag they wouldn't have handed out had this request came prior. Now, Lillard wanting out is good for the future of this franchise, but just in terms of free agency, yes, they are losers. But that is with the assumption they're unable to unload it. I'd be shocked if there's another team dumb enough to take it on, but if there is, well then yes, I would happily rescind the loser tag. Then the 76ers. I mean, I guess it could have been worse. James Harden could have just walked. At least he accepted the player option and requested out. You'll get something back for him. But outside of that, it was a rough one. Their depth's being ripped apart. Niang off to Cleveland. Milton off to Minnesota. McDaniels off to Toronto. Who did they bring in? Patrick Beverley. They clearly lost out in free agency, but that's not ultimately what will determine their offseason. These guys were role players. Their big moves are still on the horizon. The Sacramento Kings. I mean, come on. What was that? I had them as losers in that draft, and everyone was ripping me apart. I liked them creating the space, but I didn't like the deal they did to do that. That trade now looks atrocious. After giving up their first with Richaun Holmes, they freed up a max salary spot. What did they use it on? They re-signed Trey Lyles for $8 million a year and re-signed Harrison Barnes to a 3-year, $54 million deal. Yep, that's what they did. Then they gave Sabonis a new extension, but it wasn't just an extension, they renegotiated the money on his current contract. Just when you think the Kings are going in the right direction, putting their mismanagement in the past, they do stuff like this. Terrible. Then there's a bunch of teams in the middle that made notable moves. The Cavaliers gave LeVert a new deal, brought in Niang, and gave Max Strus the bag. They needed wings and forwards, they got him, that's good. But you were probably hoping it came with some more defense. Then there's the Phoenix Suns. You gotta love it when Twitter is hyping up Bates Diop and Watanabe. Now I'm not saying they're bad pickups, they weren't, especially Diop. Then they bring in Eric Gordon, okay. Bring back Drew Eubanks and Damian Lee. All these moves are solid given the circumstances. They're not losers. I'm just never gonna have a free agency haul like that in the winners column, ever, regardless of the circumstances. All this Twitter praise is reminiscent of the free agency class of Patrick Beverley, Juan Toscano Anderson, and Lonnie Walker.